The Blue Ridge Mountains rose like a wall against the sky, their ridgelines layered in mist, their forests dense enough to swallow sound and hope alike. In 1856, these mountains were not a place of freedom for him, they were a cage without bars. He had been brought there in chains, marched for days along narrow paths where wagon wheels could not go, driven by men who believed the wilderness itself would finish the work that whips and laws had begun. His name was spoken less and less the farther they traveled, until at last he was known only as the mountain slave, as if the land had already claimed him. He remembered the day the mountains first closed around him. The air grew colder, thinner, and sharp with pine. The sounds of towns faded, replaced by the endless breathing of the forest, wind moving through branches, distant water cutting through stone, the cry of animals unseen. His owner called it God's country, a place where no man could run and no secret could escape. To him, it felt like exile. Every step uphill pulled him farther from anything familiar, farther from people who spoke his language of pain, farther from the fragile idea that someone, somewhere, might hear him if he screamed. They put him to work almost immediately, cutting timber, hauling stone, clearing paths that only the mules and mountain men would ever use. The labor was brutal, but worse was the isolation. Days passed without seeing anyone but the overseer and the 2 armed men who rotated guard duty. At night, the darkness was complete, heavy enough to press against his chest. In the lowlands, night had always carried noise, voices, insects, the distant life of others. Here, silence ruled. It was the kind of silence that made a man talk to himself, just to prove he still existed. He learned quickly that the mountains were used as punishment. Men who asked too many questions, men who looked their masters in the eye for too long, men whose strength made others uneasy. These were the ones sent upward. The belief was simple: the mountains would break them. Cold winters, endless work, and loneliness would grind rebellion into dust. If a man ran, the forest would take him. If he fought back, no one would hear it. And if he died, the earth would bury him without witness. At first, he believed it too. His body bore the marks of that belief. Shoulders scarred from carrying logs heavier than sense, hands split and bleeding from frozen tools, a back that ached even in sleep. But his mind, stubborn and quiet, refused to surrender. Each morning he woke with the same thought: I am still here. It was not hope, not yet, but it was resistance in its smallest form. The overseer liked to remind him how alone he was. No roads lead out, the man would say, pointing toward the endless trees. No towns, no people, just wolves and winter. He smiled when he said it, confident that fear was enough to keep obedience intact. But what the overseer did not understand was that fear, when stretched too long, changes shape. It hardens, it sharpens, and sometimes it begins to observe. As he worked, he watched. He watched how the men moved through the forest, where they walked without looking down, where their boots slowed, where they avoided stepping at all. He noticed how sound traveled strangely, how a snapped branch could echo like a gunshot, but a careful footstep vanished into moss. He saw how weather transformed the land, how rain erased tracks, how fog swallowed distance, how snow betrayed even the strongest hunter. The mountains were not empty. They were alive, complex, and unforgiving, but not unfair. At night, lying on a bed of straw inside a crude shelter, he listened. At first, the sounds terrified him, scratching, howling, the low groan of trees shifting in the wind. Over time, those same sounds became familiar, almost comforting. He learned to tell the difference between an animal passing by and a man approaching. He learned when the forest was calm and when it was alert. Slowly, without meaning to, he began to belong to the place that was meant to destroy him. Memories of his past life returned in fragments. Faces half forgotten, voices blurred by time and pain. He remembered laughter once, long ago, and the warmth of crowded quarters where suffering was shared and therefore lighter. In the mountains, suffering was solitary. There was no one to confirm his pain, no one to witness his endurance. That, more than the labor, was the true cruelty. A man unseen could be convinced he was nothing. But each scar, each frozen dawn, each lonely mile carved something else into him. A sense of self that did not depend on recognition. he began to understand that survival here required more than strength. It required patience, silence, and memory. The mountains demanded respect, and in exchange, they offered knowledge. The men believed the terrain protected them. They did not notice how his eyes followed the slope of the land, how his hands tested the ground, how his breathing adjusted to the thin air. They saw only a slave doing as he was told, head down, spirit crushed. They mistook his quiet for surrender. By the time winter tightened its grip on the Blue Ridge, he no longer prayed to leave. He prayed to learn, to endure, to wait. Snow buried paths, but it also revealed them. Hunger sharpened his senses. Cold taught him efficiency. Pain taught him limits, and how to push beyond them without breaking. The mountains, once a prison, were becoming a map written directly into his bones. He did not yet know what he would do with that knowledge. Revenge was not a plan, not then. It was a feeling distant and burning low, like embers under ash. What he knew was simpler and more dangerous. The mountains had not broken him, and if they had failed, perhaps men could too. So he worked. He walked. Head. He learned. And deep in the Blue Ridge, where the world believed he was forgotten, something began to take shape. Not just survival, but intention. The shack stood apart from everything else, as if even neglect had abandoned it. It leaned slightly to one side, its wooden ribs warped by years of rain and winter frost, its roof patched with mismatched planks that never quite kept the weather out. The men who let him there laughed when they handed him the key, a useless gesture since the door barely closed and had no real lock. To them it was a joke of a dwelling, a place so miserable that it would finish the work their cruelty had started. They called it shelter, but it was closer to exile given form. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old smoke. A single narrow window let in a weak slice of light during the day, and at night it framed nothing but darkness. The floorboards creaked with every step, announcing movement like a confession. The fireplace was cracked, the chimney half blocked, coughing smoke back into the room whenever he tried to light a fire. In summer it trapped heat, in winter it leaked cold like an open wound. Anyone looking at it could see only failure, and that was exactly why they left him there alone. At first, the shack felt like an extension of his punishment. After endless days of labor, it offered no comfort, no safety, no illusion of rest. Rain found its way through the roof and pooled in corners. Wind slipped through gaps in the walls and whispered all night long. He slept lightly, waking at every sound, his body tense even in exhaustion. There were nights when he considered lying down and letting the cold take him, just to end the cycle of waking pain. But each morning he rose anyway, driven less by hope than by refusal. Slowly something changed. With no one watching once the door closed behind him, the shack became the only place where time belonged to him. It was the one space not measured by overseers' whistles or commands. Within those rotting walls, he could sit, think, and remember without interruption. The silence inside the shack was different from the silence of the forest. It was contained, almost private. In that quiet, his thoughts stretched out, no longer cramped by fear of being overheard. He began to notice the shack's flaws in detail, which boards bent under pressure and which held firm, where water entered during storms, how it traveled along the beams before dripping to the floor, how sound escaped through certain gaps but stayed trapped in others. He learned how the fire behaved, how to feed it just enough to avoid smoke, how to use stones to redirect heat. Each small discovery made the space a little less hostile, a little more predictable. The men never checked on him at night. They believed the forest itself was guard enough. Wolves, bears, cold and distance. What could a broken shack add to that? This neglect was meant to humiliate him, but it gave him something precious, solitude wabu. Without supervision. In that solitude, he began to experiment. Not with rebellion, not yet, but with control. He repaired small things at first, using scraps no one bothered to count. A loose plank here, a stone wedged there. Nothing noticeable from the outside, nothing that suggested improvement. He understood instinctively that visibility was danger. Anything that looked cared for would attract attention, questions, interference. So he let the shack remain ugly, leaning, pitiful. Its weakness was its disguise. At night he practiced moving without sound. He memorized which boards betrayed him and which allowed silent passage. He learned how to shift his weight, how to step where others would stumble. The shack, once an enemy, became a teacher. Its creaks warned him, its shadows hid him, its broken corners offered angles of sight the window never revealed. There were moments when he imagined the men laughing about him over their fires, convinced he was rotting away in that miserable hut. The thought no longer filled him with shame. Instead, it steadied him. Their certainty was a shield he could stand behind. As long as they believed the shack was nothing, they would never see it becoming something else. He used the forest to supplement what the shack lacked. Stones for weight, branches for support, vines for binding. Every object he brought back was small enough to seem meaningless if noticed. A man gathering scraps was invisible. A man building was suspicious. He remained invisible. The shack absorbed these additions quietly, slowly, as if growing roots of its own. Winter tested both of them. Snow pressed against the walls, wind howled through cracks, and cold settled into the bones of the structure, just as it did into his. But where before the shack had only suffered, now it endured. He redirected drafts, reinforced weak points, stacked materials where they could block wind without drawing attention. Each storm revealed a new weakness, and each weakness taught him how to strengthen without revealing intent. Loneliness still haunted him, especially during long nights when the fire burned low and memories crept in uninvited. He spoke aloud sometimes, just to hear a human voice, but even that changed. His words became quieter, more deliberate, as if the shack itself were listening. It became a witness to his transformation, holding his secrets without judgment. The idea of the shack as protection came to him gradually. Not all at once, not as a grand realization. It began as a feeling of safety when he closed the door, however flimsy it was, a sense that within those walls he could choose his thoughts. From safety came planning, and from planning came patience. The shack was no longer just where he slept, it was where he prepared. He imagined how others might enter it, how they would move, where they would step, what they would see first. He imagined their confidence, their carelessness. Men who believed a place weak behaved as if nothing there could threaten them. That belief shaped their movements, their reactions. He studied that imagined arrogance as carefully as he studied the mountain paths. Still, nothing outward changed. The shack remained crooked, miserable, forgotten. Its reputation as a punishment stayed intact. That reputation became his greatest advantage. He understood then that power did not always come from strength or numbers. Sometimes it came from being underestimated so completely that no one bothered to look twice. By the time another season turned, the shack had become an extension of him. Every sound it made carried meaning. Every shadow had purpose. It was still small, still ugly, still dismissed, but within it lived intention, discipline, and memory. What had been given to him as a symbol of abandonment had become something else entirely, a place where fear had been studied, dismantled, and reshaped into resolve. He did not yet call it a fortress, not even in his own mind, but he knew this much with certainty. Anyone who entered that shack believing it was harmless would already be at a disadvantage, and in the mountains, disadvantage could mean the difference between walking away and never being seen again. The TC Agantans spoke a language that most men never learned. To them, the Blue Ridge was scenery, obstacle, or threat, something to be crossed, conquered, or avoided. To him it became instruction. Each day as his body moved through labor and routine, his mind listened. The land was always speaking, through wind and stone, through animal movement and silence, through the way shadows shifted long before night arrived. He stopped thinking of the mountains as a place and began to understand them as a system, precise and unforgiving, but honest. It started with small observations, how deer never took the same path twice in a straight line, how birds fell silent seconds before a storm broke, how the ground near water looked firm but swallowed weight without warning. These details were invisible to men who walked with purpose but not attention. He learned to walk without purpose, without hurry, letting the land reveal itself. What looked like chaos to others slowly arranged itself into patterns. The overseers believed knowledge belonged to books and maps, things he would never touch. But the mountains held their own records. Old trees bore scars from lightning strikes decades past, marking where storms favored violence. Rock faces showed where frost split stone each winter, creating paths that shifted year by year. Animal bones told stories of failed escapes, of misjudged terrain. He studied them all, quietly, respectfully, as if reading a sacred text written over centuries. His hands grew skilled without formal teaching. Setting snares for small animals taught him tension, balance, patience. A trap failed more often than it succeeded, but each failure was a lesson. Too tight, and the animal sensed it. Too loose, and it escaped. Placement mattered more than strength. The same rule applied everywhere. Power wasted was power lost. Precision endured. He began to understand concealment, not just hiding but blending. Moss-covered stones vanished into the forest floor. Fallen logs became pathways if approached at the right angle. Smoke could be seen for miles if careless, or disappear entirely if guided by wind and cover. Even scent mattered. He learned how rain erased it, how cold preserved it, how animals tracked it better than men. Knowledge layered upon knowledge, each insight sharpening the next. The mountains also taught him restraint. There were places where one wrong step meant a broken leg, and a broken leg meant death. Places where sound traveled upward instead of outward, betraying movement long after it occurred. He memorized these dangers not with fear, but with acceptance. The land did not hate him, it simply demanded respect. In that demand there was fairness he had never known among men. As seasons turned, his senses changed. He noticed shifts in air pressure before storms, felt temperature changes through his feet before frost formed. He could tell how recently someone had passed by the bend of a branch or the depth of a footprint. These skills did not come from ambition, they came from necessity and time. The mountains rewarded those who stayed alive long enough to learn. At night, he replayed the day's lessons in his mind. He mapped paths without drawing them, memorized distances by breath and step rather than measurement. He imagined moving through the forest without light, guided only by memory and sound. Sometimes he tested himself, stepping outside the shack after dark, navigating a short distance blind, trusting what he had learned. Each successful return deepened his confidence, not pride but certainty. Men underestimated certainty. They mistook it for passivity, for dull acceptance. When he moved slowly, they thought him tired. When he spoke little, they thought him broken. They did not see the calculations unfolding behind his eyes, the quiet alignment of knowledge and patience. They did not understand that learning the mountains meant learning how men failed within them. He watched how the guards carried their weapons, how often they adjusted their grip when terrain changed. He noticed where they relaxed, where they joked, where they grew careless. They trusted paths because paths had been cleared for them. He trusted no path. He trusted only understanding. When a man trusted the ground too much, the ground punished him. When a man trusted himself too much, the mountains corrected him. There were moments of doubt, always at night, when the scale of what he was absorbing felt overwhelming. The mountains were vast, and he was one man. Knowledge alone did not equal freedom. But doubt never lingered long. Each dawn brought proof that he was still alive, still learning, still unseen. Survival itself became confirmation that he was on the right path. The forest tested him company. Instantly. Sudden storms, close encounters with predators, injuries that could have turned fatal. Each test refined him. He learned when to push forward and when to wait, when to fight nature and when to surrender to it. The mountains respected surrender more than defiance. They crushed those who challenged them directly, but carried those who moved with them. He began to think differently about space, not in terms of distance, but in terms of advantage. High ground was not always power. Visibility could be weakness. Narrow passages favored the patient over the strong. The idea settled into him deeply. Control did not come from domination, but from positioning. This lesson would echo later, though he did not yet know how or when. The shack remained his anchor point, but the mountains became his true shelter. No walls could protect like understanding. No weapon could equal preparation. He moved through the forest as if it recognized him, as if it had accepted him as part of itself. Whether that was true or not did not matter. What mattered was that he no longer felt like a prisoner within it. By the time another year passed, The mountains no longer loomed over him. They surrounded him, yes, but not as enemies. They were allies that demanded discipline and rewarded awareness. He carried their lessons quietly, storing them away like tools waiting for use. He did not rush. He did not announce change. He understood now that the most dangerous transformations happened slowly, beneath the surface, unnoticed until it was too late. The men still believed the mountains were his cage. They did not see that they had become his armor, his weapon, his teacher. And in their ignorance, they continued to walk through the Blue Ridge as guests who believed they were masters, never realizing that the land had already chosen sides. The night it began did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded the way the mountains always did, slowly, deliberately, with warning signs that only those who paid attention could read. The air grew heavy before sunset, pressing low against the trees. Birds settled earlier than usual. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. To the men, it was just another evening in the Blue Ridge, another routine patrol before fire and drink. To him, it was confirmation. The land was ready. He returned to the shack before full dark, moving with the same unremarkable posture he always wore. Nothing in his pace suggested urgency. Nothing in his face betrayed intent. Inside, the shack greeted him with its familiar creaks and shadows. He closed the door gently, not because it mattered, but because habits mattered. Ritual mattered. This place had taught him that. He sat for a long moment in the dimness, listening. The forest spoke in layers, the distant rush of water, the nearer rustle of leaves, the almost imperceptible movements of small creatures settling in for the night. Over that natural rhythm, he waited for something else. Human sound always arrived clumsily. It disturbed the balance. It announced itself. When he heard it, boots, careless and confident, he did not move. He let the sounds approach, let them blend with the night. The men were laughing, their voices loose with comfort and certainty. They were not hunting him. They were correcting a problem, answering a complaint, reminding a slave of his place. In their minds, it would be quick. The first mistake they made was assuming the shack was unchanged. The second was assuming he was inside it the way he always was. Alone, tired, harmless. He had learned long ago that expectation was a weapon, if you let it be. Tonight, he let it work for him. The men split up slightly as they approached, not enough to be tactical, just enough to talk without shouting. One circled wide, intending to cut off a non-existent escape. Another moved straight toward the door, his hand already reaching for it. Their lantern light flickered against the warped boards, casting the shack in the same pitiful shape it had always worn. The sight reassured them. Weak places did that. The door opened easily. It always had. That was intentional. The man stepped inside, expecting darkness and submission. What he found instead was imbalance. The floor shifted beneath his weight in a way it never had before. Not enough to collapse, just enough to steal certainty. His next step was louder than he intended. He cursed softly. The sound mattered. Sound always mattered. Before he could recover, something caught his clay. Not a trap in the way men imagine traps, but a sudden loss of freedom, a forced movement that broke rhythm. He stumbled forward, his lantern swinging wildly, throwing light where it didn't belong. The light revealed nothing useful, only empty corners and familiar walls. That confusion was deliberate. Pain came next, sharp and immediate, but not fatal. Pain that demanded attention, pain that narrowed thought. As the man cried out, the sound escaped the shack, but not in the direction his companions expected. The walls redirected it, sent it outward and upward, scattering it into the forest where it lost meaning. To the others, it sounded like annoyance, not alarm. By the time they realized something was wrong, they were already reacting instead of thinking. One rushed forward, another called out, their movements no longer careful. Carelessness was what the mountains punished most severely. Tonight, the mountains were not alone in that lesson. He moved then, not from rage, not from haste, but from alignment. Every step had been imagined before, every angle considered. He did not rush toward them, he let them rush into him, into the space he controlled. The shack, dismissed for so long, guided them exactly where he needed them to go. Outside, the forest closed ranks. Paths they thought they knew betrayed them. Shadows multiplied. The light of lanterns created blindness as much as vision, drawing eyes forward while danger came from the side, from below, from behind. Panic changed their breathing. Panic made them loud. He did not need to chase. He redirected. A misstep here, a blocked route there. The men turned on each other with their confusion, shouting warnings too late, firing into darkness that swallowed sound and direction. Each noise they made told him where they were. Each attempt to assert control stripped more of it away. Fear did not make him cruel. It made him precise. He remembered every night of isolation, every insult delivered with certainty that there would be no consequence. He remembered the laughter, the way power had always assumed safety. Tonight, safety belonged to the one who had prepared. The mountains absorbed what happened next without comment. Stone and soil accepted weight, accepted struggle, accepted stillness when it came. The forest did not judge. It simply endured, as it always had. What changed was who understood it. By the time silence returned, it was complete. Not the nervous silence of anticipation, but the deep, settled quiet of things returned to balance. He stood still, breathing slowly, listening not for danger but for confirmation. The land answered in the only way it ever did, by continuing. He returned to the shack before dawn. Inside, it looked the same as it always had. No signs of transformation, no signs of victory. That mattered. Appearances were protection. He cleaned what needed cleaning, erased what needed erasing, restored disorder where order had briefly existed. By morning, the shack was once again just a miserable hut on the edge of the forest. When the absence was noticed later, explanations came easily. Men went missing in the mountains. Everyone knew that. Wolves, falls, weather. No one looked at the shack and saw a fortress. No one looked at the quiet slave and saw a reckoning. He sat on the step as the sun rose, the first light cutting through the trees, touching the land with indifference. He did not smile, he did not celebrate. What had happened was not an ending. It was a correction, a shift in balance long overdue. The mountains had taught him patience. The shack had taught him concealment. The night had taught others something they would never fully understand, if they lived long enough to try. Morning came without ceremony, as it always did in the Blue Ridge. The sun did not announce itself with warmth or promise. It simply pushed pale light through the trees, revealing what the night chose to leave behind and what it chose to hide. Dew clung to leaves. Mist curled low along the ground. To anyone passing through, it looked like another ordinary mountain dawn. That ordinariness was the final disguise. He moved through the early hours with the same measured calm that had carried him through the night. There was no urgency in him now, no pounding triumph. Urgency was for men who feared consequences. He had already accepted them. Whatever followed would follow on his terms, shaped by the same patience that had shaped everything else. The Mountai Ens had not taught him to hurry. They had taught him to endure. By the time the camp stirred, rumors had already begun to form. Absence was noticed first, then explained away in half-formed sentences. Men spoke carefully, as if words themselves might summon something back. The Blue Ridge had a reputation older than any of them, and it did not need help defending it. Stories filled the gaps where certainty failed, slips near ravines, wandering off drunk, a sudden storm, an animal encounter. Each explanation comforted the speaker more than it convinced the listener. No one accused the shack. No one questioned the quiet man who returned to his labor, as he always had, head down, movements efficient but unremarkable. He did not avoid eyes. He met them briefly, neutrally, giving nothing to hold on to. Guilt, fear, defiance. Those were expressions men searched for. He offered none of them. Days passed. Then weeks. The mountains absorbed the event the way they absorbed everything else, without commentary. Paths shifted. Rain erased what little remained. Time did what time always did. It softened edges, blurred memories, replaced questions with routine. The absence became part of the landscape, mentioned less often, then only in lowered voices, then not at all. But something had changed, even if no one could name it. Men moved differently now. They stayed closer together. They avoided certain paths without agreeing to do so. Laughter came more easily during the day but died quickly aft. Dark. The mountains felt closer to them, less distant, as if the land itself had leaned in to listen. Fear had entered quietly and made itself at home. He noticed everything. Fear altered posture, altered judgment. It made men predictable in new ways. He did not exploit that predictability further, not because he could not, but because he did not need to. What mattered had already been accomplished. The balance had shifted. Power no longer flowed in one direction without resistance. The shack remained untouched by suspicion. Its reputation as a place of misery protected it better than walls ever could. Men avoided it not because they feared it, but because they dismissed it. Disdain kept them away. Pity kept them blind. He maintained it carefully, ensuring it never looked improved, never looked defended. Its weakness was its armor. At night, he sat inside and listened, just as he always had. But the listening was different now. There was no tension in it, no waiting for the sound of boots with clenched readiness. There was awareness, steady and calm. He had crossed an invisible threshold. The fear that once belonged only to him now belonged to others as well. Shared fear changed the world. Stories began to move beyond the mountains, carried by traders, hunters, men who had heard something from someone who had known someone. The details shifted with each telling, growing sharper in some places, softer in others. A shack that swallowed men, a slave who vanished, a stretch of forest where compasses failed and dogs refused to track. Truth mattered less than effect. The effect was caution. He did not listen for these stories, but they found him anyway, whispered in fragments he pretended not to hear. Each time he felt no pride, no satisfaction. Legends were dangerous things. They attracted attention. Attention brought questions. Questions brought change. He did not want the world to look too closely. Survival had taught him that being forgotten was often safer than being known. So he prepared for departure without signaling it. Not an escape in the way men imagined escapes, but a gradual loosening of ties. He memorized routes that led away from everything familiar. He cached small supplies in places no one would think to search. He timed his movements to seasons, to weather, to patterns of neglect. Leaving was not running. Leaving was choosing. The mountains had been his teachers, but they were not his destination. They had given him knowledge, discipline, and silence. They had stripped him down to essentials and shown him what remained. What remained was a man who understood space, patience, and consequence. A man who no longer needed walls to feel secure. And the time came, it came quietly. One morning he did not return to the usual path. The shack stood empty, door closed, nothing disturbed. Days passed before anyone noticed. By then, it was already too late to matter. The forest accepted him the way it accepted everything else, by closing behind him. The legend remained. It settled into the mountains like mist, appearing when conditions were right, vanishing when pressed. Locals warned strangers not to wander too far, not to underestimate the land. Some spoke of justice, others of vengeance. Some claimed the mountains themselves had risen up against cruelty. No version was complete, none needed to be. Years later, the shack finally collapsed under a heavy winter, its beams giving way to snow and rot. When spring came, there was little left to see. Nature reclaimed the space completely, erasing the last physical trace of what it had been. But absence, once created, had a way of lingering. The Blue Ridge continued to stand, layered and silent, unchanged in its endurance. Men continued to pass through, believing themselves wiser, stronger, more careful than those who came before. The mountains did not argue, they never had, and somewhere beyond them, a man carried forward what they had given him, not revenge, not hatred, but understanding. Understanding of how power faltered when it grew careless. Understanding of how patience could turn weakness into advantage. Understanding that survival, when sharpened by knowledge, could become something close to freedom. The fortress was never the shack. It was never the traps or the shadows or the night itself. The fortress was the mind that learned to see what others refused to see, and to wait until seeing was enough.